November 1934, Missing Persons Bureau, New York City. The detective's hands trembled as he gripped the letter, his face etched with disbelief. It had been years since the grieving mother last saw her daughter. That day, the little girl vanished, skipping innocently toward what she thought was a birthday party, her tiny hand in the grasp of an elderly man. But this letter could change everything. Its contents were a nightmare, and what had happened to her body. Murder, mutilation, cannibalism. Across the desk, the mother listened, her world shattering with each word. The man who had taken her child wasn't just a killer, he was a monster, a real-life boogeyman. Yet this horrifying revelation was just the beginning. What unfolded next was a story so chilling, it would go down in history as one of America's darkest chapters. Who was he, and how did they catch him? That's what you'll find out on today's episode of The Infographic Show, America's most evil serial killer, the Gray Man. It was a time of despair for the citizens of New York. The Great Depression had drained the city of its energy, leaving half of its factories shuttered and countless families trapped in poverty. Desperation clung in the air like an acrid smoke billowing from the few remaining factory chimneys. But now, the residents had to contend with a new fear, a boogeyman that stalked the streets, a gray-haired old man with a long mustache. Witnesses had seen him, including Grace's own mother, and his unassuming appearance made him all the more sinister. And the man she described sounded a lot like the old guy who had taken another boy, Billy Gaffney. On February 11, 1927, 4-year-old Billy was playing in the hallway outside of his apartment with his friend Billy Beaton. Inside of the apartment, Beaton's 12-year-old brother kept a watchful ear on them, but then the hallway fell silent. When the brother stepped outside to check, the boys were gone. Panic gripped him, and soon a frantic search party combed the building. They eventually found Billy Beaton trembling and disoriented on the roof, but Billy Gaffney had vanished without a trace. When he was asked where his friend had gone, Beaton said the boogeyman took him. Police would never find Billy's body, but one day they would hear what the killer did to him, and it was a story that defied belief. During the investigation of his abduction, the cops had a number of suspects, including the serial killer Peter Kudzanowski, whose preferred victims were youngsters. But the man Billy Beaton described was old and gray. He was fairly well-dressed, a real gentleman, just like the man who had taken 9-year-old Frances McDonald in 1924. Unlike Gaffney, Francis's body was found. It was located in the woods, hidden under some branches. His clothes had been torn from his body and his suspenders were used to strangle him. He had been beaten badly. He had been mauled. Just before he went missing, Francis's mother had seen an elderly gentleman pass by their house. She was nursing her infant daughter on the porch, and the man tipped his hat to her. She later told detectives, "I saw his thick gray hair and his drooping gray mustache. Everything about him seemed faded and gray." Later that day, as Francis was with a group of other young boys playing ball in the street, this gaunt gray man would approach them. The witnesses told detectives they watched as the man and one of the boys headed off into a wooded area. Francis's father, a policeman, organized a search party, and it wasn't until long that they found the little boy. Little did they know someone had already disturbed the killer, forcing him to abandon his twisted assault. Word soon spread throughout those poverty-stricken neighborhoods. Parents warned their children to watch out for the person they were now calling the Gray Man. Manhattan fingerprint experts were brought in to work on the case. 250 plainclothes cops joined a huge manhunt, but the Gray Man remained a shadow. That was until one day he came knocking at the door of Grace Budd's family home. On May 25, 1928, Grace's brother Edward had placed a classified ad in Sunday's edition of the New York World newspaper. Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street. He was a strong, hard-working man who was dedicated to his family. He wanted to earn enough money to get everyone out of their dirty apartment in one of the city's most overcrowded neighborhoods. On Monday, Edward's mom, Dalia, opened the door to a respectable-looking elderly gentleman. The man said his name was Frank Howard. He was a farmer out in Farmingdale, Long Island, and it just so happened he needed help. Delia told her daughter, Beatrice, to go fetch Edward from his friend's nearby apartment. The old man smiled at the girl and threw her a shiny nickel. She thought he spoke well and he had a kind face. He looked much older than his days, probably because his hair was all gray, including his droopy mustache. He told her he lived in the city for many years working as an interior decorator, but he'd had enough of the crowds and the factory smoke, so he left for Long Island, where he used his savings to buy a farm and move his 6 kids and his wife out there. Unfortunately, his wife hadn't taken the farming life and took off about a decade ago. He was left to bring up his 6 kids and run the farm all by himself. But the old man wasn't exactly telling her the whole truth. Born Hamilton Howard Fish in 1870, To an English-American father and a Scots-Irish-American mother, he was the youngest of 4 children. Tragedy struck early in his life. At just 5 years old, his father died of a heart attack, leaving his mother unable to care for him. Desperate and overwhelmed, she placed him in an orphanage. It was at this point he decided to reinvent himself, changing his name to Albert, taking it from a deceased sibling. At the orphanage, Albert was subjected to regular beatings. Strangely, while other children recoiled from the pain, Albert seemed to find a dark comfort in it. It was as if he enjoyed them. As he went from child to young adult, his interests included going to the public baths and watching men undress. His other unusual compulsion was writing obscene letters to women whose names he just found in the personal ads of newspapers. Albert found solace in anything taboo, which served him well when he became a male prostitute in New York City around the age of 19 or 20. It was on the streets of New York where he was arrested and convicted of forgery and later larceny, spending time behind bars in the notorious Sing Sing prison. But it was also on these streets that his predatory instincts began to take shape. Albert prowled for vulnerable children, not to kill, at least not yet, but to satisfy his dark, twisted desires. Even then, he was already a monster, yet the depravity that would later define him was still growing. At age 28, his mom found a wife for him, a woman 9 years older. They had 6 kids together, only for the wife to leave him and the children. She took everything, including the mattress they all slept on. This seems to have pushed Albert, who is now 37, over the edge. When he knocked on Bud's door that day, he was 58 and had been a fully formed maniac for many years. Mr. Frank Howard wasn't the honest farmer he claimed to be. There was no sprawling farm in Long Island, no honest work waiting for Delia's teenage son. It was true that he had children and a wife who had left him. Almost everything else he said was a carefully constructed lie. His real plan was far more sinister. He didn't want to hire Delia's strapping son for farm work. He wanted to lure him to a secluded place, mutilate him, and watch him bleed out, and then consume him. He told Delia his non-existent farm was a great success. He had 5 farmhands plus his children who all helped out with the labor. He had a Swedish chef who cooked up tasty meals for the workers, using meat from the dairy cows and hundreds of chickens on the farm. But now one of his farmhands was leaving, and that's what had brought him to Delia's door, looking for her son. An out-of-breath Edward soon arrived at the house after running from his friend's place. Sure, he wanted the job. When could he start? Mr. Howard said immediately, and he paid $15 a week. A very reasonable wage for the time, and if Edward's friend wanted the job, well, why not? He could always use another farmhand. Business was so good these days, which was more than could be said for many New Yorkers still recovering from the economic crash. Mr. Howard said he'd return to the Budd house on Saturday to pick up Edward and take him by train to the farm. It was so refreshing in these dark days to find such a kind and friendly gentleman. With this well-paid job for her son, her family would surely be okay. When Saturday came, the Budds were disappointed when Mr. Howard didn't show up. They did, however, receive a handwritten note explaining a delay and that he'd be there tomorrow. This note would one day become an important piece of evidence. On Sunday, just as promised, Mr. Howard returned. At about 11 a.m., Delia opened the door to find him standing outside, smiling. His arms were full of cartons of strawberries and pot cheese fresh from the farm, or so he said. Suddenly, a little girl appeared hiding behind her mother's skirt, flashing a shy smile at the gray-haired stranger. Delia introduced her as her 10-year-old daughter, Grace. As kids tend to be at that age, she was full of giddy curiosity. It was at this very moment his plan changed. Mr. Howard explained that he had planned to take Edward back to the farm that day, but he had to have a delay. He was throwing a birthday party for his niece, who was actually about the same age as Grace. He also spoke to Mr. Budd, who seemed impressed by this very friendly visitor in front of him. He was a simple man who'd left the city and done good for himself, with 20 acres of profitable farmland. Still, he did wonder why, with all that money, Mr. Howard wore quite a tattered-looking suit. As they ate their lunch, Mr. Howard couldn't take his eyes off of Grace. She hummed songs and ran around excitedly. He commented that one day she'd grow up to be a real heartbreaker, and that was about the time he introduced his new plan. He said maybe Grace could go back with him to the farm and join the party. There'd be games and cake and lots of other children. They needn't worry, he'd bring her back later. He had kids and grandkids of his own, so he knew how to take care of children. After the party, he would come straight back for Edward and the job could commence. The Budds, who didn't want to let this future employer of their son down, agreed. They did at least ask where his sister lived, the mother of the birthday child. He told them 137th Street and Columbus Avenue. Had they known the city better, they would have realized Columbus ends at 110th Street. Grace was excited about the party. She'd been to church earlier and was wearing her pretty white silk confirmation dress, a pair of white silk stockings, and some faux pearls that made her look much older. Mr. Howard then took a huge wad of bills from his pocket, asking Grace to count them. The Budds had never seen so much money as they proudly watched their clever daughter dutifully count the stack in front of her. After Grace had finished counting, Mr. Howard handed over 50 cents for some candy for her and her sister Beatrice. He gave Edward and his friend Willie $1 each and told them to go see a movie, and he'd return later in the evening to pick them up. Delia had taken a liking to this kind old man, but she was concerned about handing her daughter over to him. Her husband didn't share her concern, so Mrs. Budd got Grace's coat and her best hat, the one with the ribbon streamers, and sent her on her way. Mrs. Budd watched Grace's ribbons dance in the wind, her hand clasped in the fingers of the man who would later be nicknamed the Werewolf of Wisteria. At the train station, Grace didn't notice the subtle, sinister detail that would seal her fate. Mr. Howard purchased 2 tickets, a one-way ticket for her and a return ticket for himself. That night, the Budd family waited and waited. No one slept a wink, and in the morning they went to the police station to report their daughter missing. After conducting some preliminary investigations, Police Lieutenant Samuel Dribbin delivered the devastating news that made their stomachs sink. The address Mr. Howard had provided didn't exist. Neither did the sister he'd spoken so warmly about. Worse yet, there were no farms in Farmingdale, Long Island tied to anyone by that name. The Budds spent the next few weeks going into the police station and looking at the rogues gallery lineups, men known to have done awful things to children. Police put 20 detectives on the case and mailed about 1,000 flyers to people's houses. They searched high and low for an old gray man and found nothing. They didn't know it, but the gray man had strategies to avoid being seen. The best evidence they had was the message he had written to the Budds, which had been sent from the Western Union office in Manhattan. The man who had sent it, they said, was probably educated just because the spelling and grammar were correct. The truth was, Fish was not very educated. He had had other things on his mind when he could have been studying in his younger years. He'd spent much of his young life being obsessed with human anatomy. As usual with serial killers, grim fascination led to escalation. When he was about 30, he had a sadomasochistic relationship with an intellectually disabled 19-year-old named Thomas Bedden. Whether Bedden agreed to the sadomasochism remains a mystery, but he certainly experienced extreme pain. Fish took him to an old farmhouse where he tied him up and tortured him, an odyssey of suffering lasting many days that ended with castration. Fish would later recount to stunned detectives that he would never forget Bedden's screams. He had been kind enough to pour bleach on the wound and wrap it before he left, slipping a $10 bill in Bedden's pocket and kissing him on the cheek. This was just the beginning of Fish's escalation. As the years passed, detectives knew enough to link the Gray Man cases, but as time went on, the searches ended. Only one man, Detective William F. King, didn't give up looking for this mysterious child abductor. King knew if he kept the story alive, he had a better chance of solving it. In November 1934, he gave false information to the reporter Walter Winchell. The next day, Winchell's story appeared in the newspaper. I checked on the Grace Budd mystery. She was 8 when she was kidnapped about 6 years ago, and it's safe to tell you that the Department of Missing Persons will break the case, or they expect to, in 4 weeks. None of that was true, and Grace was 10 years old, but no doubt the story would have caught the eye of the killer who police knew read the newspapers. And it did catch his eye. 10 days later, the letter arrived at the Budd family house. Delia and her husband, like so many poor Americans of their generation, couldn't read, so Edward read it for them. In it, the killer made chilling references to the gifts he brought to their house that day, the strawberries and pot cheese. He recounted that when he and their daughter got back to his place, he let Grace pick flowers, after which he unrobed and hid in the wardrobe. When he called out to Grace, she ran back inside, unaware of the horror awaiting her. He leapt from the wardrobe, detailing how Grace fought back fiercely, kicking, biting, and scratching, but her strength wasn't enough. He overpowered her, strangled her to death, and in a final grotesque revelation, he claimed to have cut up her flesh, cooked it, and consumed it. Detective King recognized the handwriting as the same as the Western Union note the Budds had gotten all those years ago. He didn't think that this was one of the many hoaxes police had received over the years. Still, some of the letters seemed outlandish, including the part where the writer had expressed how he had acquired a taste for human meat. The killer said in 1894 his friend had traveled on a steamer under Captain John Davis from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. According to the letter, famine was widespread in the country, and his friend supposedly developed an appreciation for cannibalism, particularly the flesh of children, who he claimed were sold for food. Upon returning to the United States, the friend supposedly continued this gruesome practice, abducting children from the streets to kill and eat. The friend allegedly claimed that human flesh was like no other. The killer had to try it. And that's how the Gray Man, now with a refined palate, met the Budd family. As Detective King had hoped, the killer, who obviously wanted the family to suffer while he played games with the police, had made a significant mistake. He noted a small hexagonal emblem on the envelope, under which were the letters NYPCBA. King ascertained that this stood for New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. He then met with the association and looked for handwriting of members that might match the handwriting in the letter. He met with each member and asked them if they had used the association stationery. No one had. What had seemed like a promising clue turned out to be nothing more than a frustrating dead end. But just as King was about to walk out the door, the janitor approached him. The janitor revealed that just a few weeks ago he had stolen a few sheets of paper and some envelopes from the club. He said he'd likely left a few of them at his old rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street. When King visited soon after, the landlady stood back in shock when he described a gray-haired man with a long mustache. A man just like that stayed here for about 2 months, and he had checked out a couple of days ago. His name, she said, was Albert H. Fish. She explained that during his stay, his son had often sent money. Before he checked out, he told her another letter would arrive and he planned to collect it in person. On December 13, 1934, the landlady made a call to Detective King. Albert Fish was there right now. He returned looking for his letter. He was sitting down drinking a cup of tea when King arrived. When the detective asked his name, a suspicious Fish stood up and said, "Yes?" But before King could move an inch forward, Fish pulled out a razor. King quite easily grabbed Fish's arm, twisted it, and the blade fell to the floor. He might have gotten his man, but he didn't know just what kind of monster he had in his hands. Fish's confession would be one of the biggest events in law enforcement history. It would confound psychiatrists and disgust the public, even though the public got a very censored version through the media. On Wednesday, March the 13th, in the New York Times, right next to the headline, "2 policemen arrested for stealing candy," was another headline. Fish is identified by girl's parents. Fish admitted to the Grace Budd murder. He told the cops that on that day, he dropped off his butcher knives at a newsstand and picked up Grace at her house. He returned for the knives before heading to the train station. He said when they got off the train, Grace told him he'd left his package behind. Fish ran back and picked it up, giving Grace a heartfelt thank you. He took her to an abandoned house he called Wisteria House on Mountain Road in Irvington, where he had killed her and chopped her body into pieces. Over the next 9 days, he would eat those pieces. When asked why he would do such a depraved act, Fish could offer no explanation. Still, in many interviews he had with cops and psychiatrists, he said after the murder of Grace he felt a deep sorrow. A police captain then asked why the letters, why put the family through so much pain, to which Fish said he just liked writing. He was clearly insane, but was he legally insane? After his wife had left him with their 6 kids, clearing out all of their belongings, it seems Fish lost his mind. He started hallucinating, explaining that John the Apostle gave him instructions to kill. In the many interviews, he would ramble on and on about the Bible, often citing passages in full. He said surely God and his angels would have stopped him if he had been in the wrong. It was about this time in his life when his fascination with pain went into overdrive. He began embedding long needles into his thighs and abdomen, making his every move excruciatingly painful. It sounded absurd, but when they x-rayed him, they found over 29 needles embedded in his flesh. He also admitted to sticking needles in his young victims. He would beat himself with a paddle studded with nails. He even had his own children beat him. He'd play a game with them, and if he lost, which he always did, they were allowed to beat him with a paint stick or a hairbrush. It seems, though, he never hurt them. Still, they didn't visit him at the jail. He not only admitted to killing Grace and eating her, but he eventually said he'd killed those other 2 kids, Billy and Francis. The question for detectives was what else had Fish done over those decades of depravity where he was sticking needles into himself? The answer was abducting young people from streets all over the U.S., usually poor kids, often African American kids, or kids with learning difficulties, targeting those that society often overlooked. In his own chilling words, he admitted that those children were less likely to be missed, less likely to raise an alarm once they disappeared. Over those many blood-strewn years, he used his trusted torture and killing kit, a meat cleaver, a hacksaw, and a butcher's knife. He called these his instruments of hell. How often he used them is not certain. He might have murdered 7 or as many as 25 kids, and he hurt hundreds, maybe as many as 400. It was now up to the psychiatrists on the defense team to persuade a jury just how totally insane Albert Fish was. In an interview, he told the defense's chief expert witness, Dr. Frederick Wertham, that he would lure the kids away with candy. He made sure never to return to the same neighborhood, which doesn't sound like the mind of someone clinically insane. He planned ahead, and he had strategies. Still, Dr. Wertham said Fish was extremely infantilistic. He suffered from paranoid psychosis. When asked about his final diagnosis, he said, "He is insane." He wasn't surprised at all to hear that many of Fish's relatives, including some members of his close family, had serious mental health problems, including psychosis, mania, and schizophrenia. 2 other psychiatrists for the defense also said he was completely insane, but the 4 for the prosecution were not in agreement. Many tears were shed on the witness stand. Mr. Budd broke down and could barely finish his testimony, racked with guilt as he was for convincing his wife to let Grace go that day. Fish didn't look moved at all, only saying to his lawyer he preferred to live because God still has work for him to do. His stepdaughter took the stand and said Fish was a good father. Still, she talked about all those violent games he liked to play with his kids and the fact that he would often show them a magic trick. He could insert needles under his fingernails and he would barely even flinch. After 10 days, it took the jury just an hour to reach their verdict of guilty. They knew he was insane, but felt he'd done enough to deserve to be executed. Witnesses said that day Fish looked upset by the verdict, but seemed very much at ease when he told he would be getting the electric chair. On January 16, 1936, he received his final blast of pain. Strapped to the chair in Sing Sing's execution chamber, his last words were, "I don't even know why I'm here." Despite rumors to the contrary, the execution was quick and maybe not as painful as Fish might have hoped. Albert Fish's story is one of the darkest chapters in true crime history. But what do you think? What shocked you the most about his horrifying crimes? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to hear another totally warped tale, have a look at The Serial Killer Nobody Talks About, Real Life Candyman. Or try something more modern, The Pig Farmer, Canada's most evil serial killer.